On behalf of the Church of Ireland Centre DCU, I'm delighted to welcome you all to our webinar, Protestants in the Irish Language. My name is Anne Lodge and I'm the Director of the Church of Ireland Centre. Táim Harveh buíoch de Linda Irvin agus Gary Hastings a bheith ag caintling agus donna cahar a beg a freigart, Danny Kennedy, Ida Milne, Trevor England agus Deirdre Nuttall. Freisin táim an a bhuiach don lucht éisteachta na daoine seo ling agus na daoine ling ar an idirlíon. I'm most grateful to all involved in this webinar. Our two keynote speakers, Linda Irvin and Gary Hastings, will both speak to us about their experiences learning the Irish language as adults and engaging in Irish culture. Our four respondents are Danny Kennedy, chairperson of the Ulster Unionist Party, Dr. Ida Milne, historian and co-editor of Protestants and Irish, Trevor England, former Irish rugby international who is active in intercommunity peace initiatives, and Dr. Deirdre Nuttall, author of Different and the Same. I'm also very thankful to our small studio audience here and to those of you joining us online. Both the studio audience and the online audience are invited to ask questions or make comments after the six speakers have concluded their inputs. Our online audience can add questions or comments in the chat box. Cuireann fáilte inis chuig an talamh Páirigóidir atá mar cathaoirleach a nocht. And now I am most delighted to welcome my colleague, Professor Páirigóidir, our chair for this webinar.
Gur míle mágad Ann agus fáilte bhór óibh go léir is privilege domsa bheith mar cathaoirleach a nocht ar an seminar Harveh simúil seo. It's a great privilege to me to chair tonight's seminar, which is a really interesting topic, and I'm looking forward so much to hearing the speakers and to see what questions they generate from those of you in the audience here in front of me and those on Zoom or online as well. So our first speaker, as Anne has indicated, is Linda Irvine. So current fáilte raibh Linda nish agus midagiri éisteach lena bhfuil le ráchaí. So gur míle mágad.
Gur mágad. Miss Linda Irvine is Banister May leis an Tionscadal Turas in Harveh Forestja. So I'm Linda Irvine, and I'm the manager of the Turas project in East Belfast. And my sort of journey, my Turas with the language came about very unexpectedly. Just over 10 years ago, I did a taster session in Irish with a group of women from the Newtownards Road and the Short Strand, which is a nationalist area in East Belfast. And Hitchman Raleigh and Changa, I fell in love with the language. I decided I would learn a couple of focal, a few words. And it didn't seem to me at the time to be a big deal that I, as a Protestant, was learning a bit of Irish, but unfortunately some people took exception to it. It got a bit of interest, media interest at the time, because my husband was the leader of the Progressive Unionist Party. So it was seen as being newsworthy, I suppose. And Bran and I were both kind of quite surprised that it was, did get so much interest. And there was I suppose, a mixture of responses. There were people who, like myself, from the Protestant community, were interested and felt, oh, I'd like to do this as well. And maybe they saw the fact that I was doing it as some sort of, I don't know, permission that they could do it too. And then there was another strand who, became very hostile, who felt that I was, I don't know, I was accused of leading the Protestant people down the green brick road into the Irish bog, which was a bit over the top in my opinion. I was learning a few words of Irish. I wasn't plotting the downfall of the state. But I think for me, the most surprising thing was that I too had a perception about the Irish language, about who the Irish language belonged to, about who spoke Irish. It wasn't an issue for me. It wasn't something that deterred me from learning it, but it was a perception that I had, and a perception that was totally wrong. And once I got involved in the language, people said to me, have you read this, or did you know that? And I read a lot of books that had been produced by the Old Tack Trust, who are sadly no longer functioning. And they were amazing, things like Presbyterians in the Irish language, Snoddy's Hidden Ulster. And I used to sit at night and say to my husband, oh, did you know did anybody ever tell you? And I was amazed at this information that I was discovering about the links between the Irish language and my own community. Also, even, very basic knowledge, the fact that Belfast, the original name was Belfarstia. Now, I mean, I'm somebody who was born in Belfast, spent my whole life in Belfast. I didn't have that basic information that my home city was called Belfarstia, which of course means mouse of the sandbank ford. And as I started to learn Irish, I started to realise it was all around me, in our place names, in our surnames, in the structures and the words that we use in our everyday speech, that Hiberno English, that there were so many connections. The Church of Ireland Church, the Presbyterian Church, all sorts of organisations that I seen as being Protestant, and in my opinion shouldn't be linked to the Irish language, didn't have a natural link, and yet there it was. And in some ways for me, it, I suppose, gave me permission as somebody from the Protestant community to embrace this language, which even looking back on that now was a strange thing to feel, that I needed to justify it even to myself. And I suppose, 10 years later, I don't feel like that. I love the language. I'm learning the language. I'm in the second year of my degree doing Irish. And the idea that I would reject the language or need to justify my position is now just ridiculous. Because why would I not be learning Irish? Why would I not love the language? One of my friends, who also a Protestant, who started learning, somebody said to her, why would you as a Protestant want to learn Irish? And she said, why would I not want to? I'm surrounded by it. Why would I not want to? Do you not think it'd be a stranger thing that I wouldn't want to learn it when it's in my environment, when it links me to everything that's around me? And I remember thinking, yeah, that's very true. That actually makes a lot of sense. So it's this idea that, because I come from the Protestant tradition, that I'm supposed to take up a certain stance that doesn't fit with the language. One of the early attacks that was made on me was about Ulster Scots. And I'm always very honest about this as somebody from the Protestant community. I had no interest in Ulster Scots. I didn't really know what Ulster Scots was. I was quite derogative about it. And it was actually Irish speakers who pulled me up on that and made me go away and look at it. The other thing that made me go away and look at it was the fact that some people who had no interest in Ulster Scots, no respect for Ulster Scots, but they were going to use it as a stick to beat me with. And my place wasn't to have an interest in Irish and to hate Ulster Scots. I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to be in that position. So I went away and I looked at Ulster Scots, and of course once I looked at it properly, I found it really interesting and I became quite intrigued with it. And what intrigued me even more was when I realised a lot of the words in Ulster Scots are Gaelic, because Scots borrowed in Gaelic and Gaelic borrowed in Scots. And, we have that in Scotland, and we also have it here in Northern Ireland, this overlap between two distinctive languages. And I realised quite quickly that the people who polarise in the languages, of course, have got it wrong, because when you embrace one, you're embracing the other. And why can't we do that? What's the problem in liking Irish and learning Irish and also liking Ulster Scots as well and being intrigued with it? Because that's who we are, especially in Northern Ireland, but in other parts of Ireland as well. We draw on, lots of heritage. I love when we look at our place names, because many of our place names contain not one language, and I especially think of the Ballies, Bala. They are, Bala, obviously Irish, town or townland, but then linked with sometimes another Irish word, like Ballygowan, the townland of the Smith, but maybe a Norman French word, or an English word, or a Scots word. And for me, that kind of represents who we are. that whole mixture of things, it doesn't take anything away from us. I don't feel the need to say I am only one thing. I'm not only one thing. I am a mixture of my ancestors who were Irish and Scots and English and goodness knows what else. And I think that enriches me, that brings something to me. And I get very, very despondent when I see this polarization of communities, polarization of language, polarization of culture that exists within Northern Ireland, and that you're only allowed to fit into one box. And of course, the majority of us don't fit in one box. You know, I look at my own background, and on one side of my family, on my father's side, my grandmother, a woman born in a kitchen house in Thistle Street on the Newton Arch Road, her name was Ulster Scots. Her family were rural and very Ulster Scots names. She married an Englishman from London. On my mother's side, my grandfather was a Presbyterian with a very Irish name, and my grandmother was a Catholic woman, Kathleen Kelly from Clifton Street. So what does that make me? What box does that tick? You know, what am I meant to pick? So, you know, I don't want to be forced into that. And it's the same with language. You know, I can draw on this. This is here. It's a living language. It's part of something that's around me, and I want to embrace it. And I always think back to, I suppose, one of the things that first intrigued me when I was introduced to the language was the fact that in Irish, to say that you speak Irish, you don't, it's not the way you express it in English, like say I speak Irish. You say, I have Irish. It belongs to me, to Gaelic Ogam. And I remember when I was told that, I remember thinking, I would love to be able to say that. I would love to be able to say that it's part of who I am. It's part of my identity. And that's what I've been working to do over the last 10 years. I'm not a natural language learner. I find learning language very difficult. But, you know, Giri needs far, but ain't the Fadala. So it's getting better, but very slowly. And I suppose because I love it, you know, it's not hard work. It's been an enjoyable thing to do. It's also, I suppose, been a life-changing thing to do, a life-enriching thing to do, because the people that I've met, the places that I've traveled to, the doors that it's opened, the knowledge that it's brought me, and, you know, the tourist that I'm on, the journey that I'm on, I don't know if I'm going to be Leifa at the end of it. I don't know if I'm going to be fluent at the end of it. I know people who, in my opinion, they're Leifa, they're fluent, but they would say they're not. But the destination is not the important part, but the journey is. And I wouldn't have missed this journey for the world. For me, it's just a wonderful thing to be on. And I've spent the last 10 years encouraging and helping and supporting other Protestants to do the same thing. And, you know, the thanks I've had, the joy I've seen in people's lives has been amazing. We've faced our challenges, of course we have. The greatest challenge we've had recently is with our Irish-speaking Niscal, integrated Irish medium Niscal. It's been a very difficult time, and we faced a lot of intimidation, threats, all sorts of things, but we pushed ahead. We now have 15 children. We have 25 expressions of interest for next year. Our children are very mixed, more than just in a religious sense, culturally, all sorts of ways. It's such diversity within a small group is amazing. We have to be out of our present temporary venue by the end of June, and we don't have anywhere to go in September. It's very difficult because we are at the mercy of other people's bias, and that's a hard place to be. But we push ahead and we will succeed. So I suppose that's my journey, and Carmela Margaret. Thank you.
Carmela Margaret Linda san scale intake simulation agus an trust Marador to hen. I think you've given us a really interesting insight on your journey with the Irish language. And I'm sure that that's there may be some questions that people might ask to go further into it. But I'm going to call on Gary Hastings now to share his experience and his trust leis an Gaeilge. So Gary, fáilte rud.
Good mai agus mar teisifelig. Bhfuil mar dúsma bhuiachas a gáil an is a ghiriarm piece of cancha Shaw Horton, Shaw North. I was told, as Linda said, to talk about growing up in Loyalist East Belfast and Northern Irish and what that was like. And there's a big overlap with what Linda's already said, but I started perhaps in a different time and came at it from a different angle. I was born and reared between the Woodstock and Craigie and Riven Hill roads, so I'm officially a wise man from the east in Belfast, something of which I'm quite proud. And if it's inverted snobbery, then that's fair enough. My dad and a lot of our ones worked in the shipyard, and my uncle was president of Glentoran Supporters Club, and those are real East Belfast credentials. And I never knowingly met a Catholic or got to know one until I was 18 at university. Such was the area we lived in. I went to university to do physics and Korean, but I discovered cigarettes and drink and wee girls and traditional music, not necessarily in that order, and the physics hadn't a chance. And traditional music was a big deal then, and there was a couple of ne'er-do-wells in my chemistry class for musicians too, but there was a very healthy crowd about the university at that time in Korean in the Irish Studies department, and there's a lot of them played as well. Up to this point, my musical development, I had only learned to play Stand Up for Jesus and God Save the Queen on the bagpipes, which isn't very far down the road. But this was the first time I actually came across Roman Catholics to talk to and drink with and get to know. There just weren't any where we lived. You heard about them. There was the usual anti-Catholic folklore floating about, and you saw houses where they'd been burnt out. This was in the early 70s. But with university, I actually got to meet them and found out they were just the same as ourselves, only different, which was actually slightly disappointing in a way. But meeting people who spoke Irish was amazing and surprising. I knew a couple of girls very well, both from Gweedore and Donegal, the same age as myself, whose English was serviceable but not very extensive. It was their second language by a mile, and it was extremely patchy. And it was fascinating to meet somebody like that, the same age as me, from a couple of hours up the road. It was exotic, strange and foreign, and still Irish in the same country. I'd never suspected anything like that existed. The only Irish I would have had was Céad Míle Fáilte and Bord na Móna. But I fell in with all these musicians and singers and people talking Irish around me all the time. And it was no big deal. There was no flag waving or shouting about it. It was before it became perceived as political, and they did it because they loved it and they were interested in it and fascinated by it. And that sort of enthusiasm is infectious, as you know. And the fact I was a prod was no big deal. If you were interested in what they were interested in, you were in. In my entire career in both traditional music and in Irish, I never had a bad experience with the people actually involved with the music or the language. There was the other head of balls on both sides of the house who made the trouble. Religion, the job I'm in now, is much more complicated than Irish speakers or traditional musicians, and I've had more trouble with those of the same religion as myself than anybody else over the last 30 years. Physics department and I parted company, and I played music full time for a while, but eventually I went back to do, there was an intensive course in Irish and Korean, and I did that. Got you from Bord na Móna up to A level in 6 months, at the end of which your ears was bleeding. But then I did the degree in Irish studies there, which was mostly taught through Irish. And I'd go home every couple of months after a year or so, and I mightn't have spoken English in between, because I didn't need to. Almost everybody I was hanging around with were Irish speakers, and it wasn't a big deal just. Now, my own people were a bit bewildered, as you might understand, but all they really wanted to know, was there any money in it, and would you get a job? And they thought, like my granny thought I was still at school, and she couldn't understand how you could be 20 and still at school. And I might as well have been doing Serbo-Croat or Urdu or something for all the odds it would make. Irish was just something obscure they knew nothing about. And my granny didn't even know there was an Irish language. How could she if you were reared in East Belfast? But increasingly, Irish became perceived as one of the trappings of the new nationalism of that time, and it became a less healthy pursuit. Our Roy, my dad's brother, who Linda may have met, was known as Kiddo Hastings. And he organised me a summer job in the co-op dairy off the Ravenhill Road as a student. And he says, you mind yourself in there, son, there's some scary boys about. I says, Roy, if they ask me what I'm doing at university, what would I say to them? And he says, just tell them the truth. And if you have any bother, he says, tell them Kiddo Hastings was your uncle. So I was about a week on the job and I was hanging around, it was break time, and a boy says, "Mere over here, son, to have a yarn with you." And we went into the toilets. There was a 6 boys standing around smoking wee fags, you see. And he says, "You Athenian?" Just straight out, like no Greek nor nothing. I says, "No." He says, "Are you still at school?" I says, "Aye." He says, "What are you doing?" I says, "Irish." He says, "Are you a Papish?" I says, "No." "Where do you live?" "Round the corner up there." He says, "All right." "Are you not a Papish?" I says, "No." "Kiddo Hastings is my uncle." He went, "All right." He says, "All right, boys, that's Kiddo's nephew. On you go, son." That was the last I heard of it. He was a man who you might say was a person of note in certain organisations. But it has to be said, if I hadn't such privileged connections as ROI, I might have been in a slot of bother. But in the late 1970s, a number of students doing Irish with me in Korean had gone through Long Kesh one way or another, and I asked no questions, but everybody knew what was what and who was who. I never had a problem, as I said, but I had some interesting discussions from time to time, and there were 3 or 4 other Protestant students as well as myself in the Irish department. And I knew to be careful, like this was 1977 or no, 78 or 9. All right, my uncle warned me off playing music in a certain establishment in the Short Strand. He says he called me over one day. "You playing in there?" I says, "Aye." He says, "I'm sure there's nice people inside, but the ones that's watching it aren't nice. I haven't got a good suit to go to your funeral." And so on. All right. So I stopped going to this place. So somebody was mating me, if you know what I mean. I remember the first night as a student being in a room after the pub student party, like 20 lads in a room throwing down drink and realizing I was the only Protestant in the room. And that was a really strange experience for me. I don't know if it makes sense to anybody here, but the time, not that it was a bad thing. I knew them all and they were all very nice, but I remember it just struck me, I was the only one there, you know. The best story I think of that time was the GAA in the university organised in the sports pavilion in the university drink as much as you like for a £5 night, which was very good value. And they asked us to go along and play tunes, and we could get in for free, you see. And they carried us over drink all night. And so we were in a wee circle in the corner playing tunes. And behind us was like Sodom and Gomorrah, you know, but it was harmless enough. Like. And after a while, it went very quiet in the room. Later on, and a fella came over to me and he tapped me in the back and says, "Gary," he says, "would you mind if we sang a few rebel songs?" So what are you going to say? There was 200 of them. I says, "Aye, surely." And he says, "Gary says it's all right." And they all cheered, like, you know. And the boys beside me turned around and says, "God, you boys have got us bit completely." He says, "We have to ask your permission now, you know." But it was all very, very pleasant. The fact that they would ask you, the fact that they didn't know you were there and then plastered. So that's actually very impressive still. Agus fósman sin mahína Katrina í Galahoy, agus we bart Huaistugin Con agus Caitslin, and we reared them in Irish as far as we could. Con was more or less a monoglot to all intents and purposes till he was 3, and my parents, of course, were fascinated by this. But when he went to nursery school the first day, he came home speaking all the English he knew all the time and continued like that, even though the language of the home was Irish. Caitslin had a more mixed language content herself. They're both passively fluent still today. They would understand anything and everything, but they would very rarely speak it. Katrina's mother was a native speaker from the Bluestacks in Donegal. Hanna Vicky Vihal Huijian, which I was so proud of her patronymic. That takes you right back before the famine, which is more genealogy than most of my people know about her own ones, you know. Hanna Vicky hadn't spoken Irish for maybe 50 years at this stage. So when we started rearing our kids, she was pleased and amazed, and her Irish was absolutely gorgeous when she got it going again. She had all the wee rhymes and things you would do with Waynes that we would never have known about, not being reared in the Gaeltacht. Language classes can never teach you that kind of thing. For the last 40 years or so, I reckon I've spoken Irish perhaps nearly 40–50% of the time. And all in all, I had the chance to step outside what was the very narrow ghettoized community I was reared in and see something else and never leave my own country. Though my own ones were very moderate, they considered themselves part of Great Britain without actually saying it out loud ever. They just were. They watched British media and would never have seen RTE, for example. But when I had the chance to throw the leg over the fence, in the end, it turned out to be pretty much the same, but different all at the same time. A mirror image of what I was reared in, parallel to us, influenced by the same things as us, but reacting differently and it helped me understand my own people because I had a different place to stand to look from. The language gave me a second tongue and a second mind to think with and a new eye to look through. Now, in retrospect, my people were definitely bewildered by my learning Irish, not for political reasons, but it was so far outside their experience and they thought you needed a job. And now I've lived in what we call the Free State for 30 years now, if you excuse the phrase. I got into trouble in the pub one night when I called it that. My experience of Irish here amongst Protestants, just out of interest, is that in the main, the Irish language is rarely an integral part of how they see themselves, to the extent that having been educated in the Republic with Irish classes in school, they seem to nearly all pretend or protest strongly to have no knowledge at all of Irish, much more than Catholics of the same age who, while equally unable to speak it, would say they'd love to have learnt it right. An odd Protestant would say that, but few and far between. Now, that's a broad personal generalization, but it's my experience. They're not antagonistic, but they're just not interested. It's just not their business. That's what it feels like. I was amazed that a couple of southern-bred and reared bishops I've known couldn't even make an attempt to say the Lord's Prayer in Irish or say just the first line to kick it off, which is very sad, to say the least. The Protestant community in the South in general has been quite inward-looking since partition, as we know. There was never a big involvement with Irish. There was some, but to what actual extent's unclear, beside a relatively short list of famous people like George Birmingham and Douglas de Haige, for example. Cumann Gaelach na Haglaigh in my own church was never an extensive movement, and it seems to have drawn membership mostly amongst the better off, the respectable and academic. I suspect that's always been the extent of Protestant involvement in the last century, though I'm neither well off, respectable, nor academic, so I'm a notable exception. Having said that, in my time, there's a growing relationship between members of the Church of Ireland and the Irish language in the South. Irish language services are not just something that happens occasionally in Dublin, which was the case. They turn up all over the country now as clergy feel free and interested to do them. Not especially fluent clergy, but willing and sympathetic and happy to do it. Thanks to Cumann Gaelach na Haglaigh and the excellent work they did in the last few years, the language is less alien than once it might have seemed to be. At the same time, in the South, the religiously active Protestant minority is shrinking drastically in the same way the Catholic majority is doing. Religious faith, and hence badges and distinctions, are on the way out, or on the way to becoming a small minority pursuit on both sides. So Protestant involvement with the language here will be influenced by wider community involvement. Tribal groups are becoming an irrelevance in the South, and the language is now accessible to all if anyone's interested. I do understand, though, why Ulster Prods are very afraid of not belonging, either to an Irish-speaking world, should they choose to enter it, and then being seen to have substandard credentials, or on the other hand, being cast out of our own world if we took the step to learn the language. I was in the position and was lucky enough to do both things and didn't lose my own faith, integrity, or people in the process, but I did acquire friends, knowledge, another tongue in my mouth, and a new key to living in the world. Gura Mayogov as Esther Bishop.
Gurmina Margaret Harry, Gary Vishishin Haraves Simu Lagus Stolangul stand-up routine Gutin. I think Gary could do a stand-up routine on his experiences with the Irish language and would entertain us royally. So now, having had two really interesting contributions from Linda and Gary, we now have 4 respondents, and I invite Danny Kennedy to kick off the first response.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed, Pádraig, for your, well, can I thank, first of all, Professor Lodge and indeed Archbishop Jackson, and I thank Linda and Gary for their presentations, and for the other colleagues, Ida, Deirdre and Trevor, who will respond after me. And can I say, by way of biographical, I suppose, detail, my name is Danny Kennedy. I live in a place called Bessbrook, which is just outside Newry. And I was for 19 years a member of the Assembly at Stormont and served in 2 executives there. So I've been a member of the Ulster Unionist Party since 1974. I'm currently chairman which is interesting. But anyway, I wanted to say that I am born and bred in South Armagh, and I suppose a bit like Linda said, I think that I don't have a lot of interest, particularly in Ulster Scots language, right? I do, however, I'm very committed to Ulster Scots culture, particularly through royal orders and bands. And I played a bass drum in a silver band for 44 years, but on doctor's advice had to give it up last year because I wasn't doing anything for my back. But I have therefore had some knowledge and contact with the Irish language, and obviously in South Armagh, you would understand a lot of the roads and the nameplates carry the Irish name, first of all, and Drumnahunchin and, you know, Drummacavall and other stuff like that. So I'm not a complete Philistine. I'm also was informed. I spent 25 years as a member of Newry Moor District Council, and one of the things I did learn from one of the Sinn Féin members was that the surname Kennedy in Irish means ugly head. Right now, unfortunately, he was correct in that. But apparently, Kennedy is among the top surnames in Ireland itself. So there are quite a number of ugly heads, presumably, about. But what I would also say is my late great-grandfather was a man called Jones Black, who lived in the latter part, I suppose, of the 19th century, the early 1800s, and he was fluent in Irish. And I think it's been fascinating for me, and I've never been able to find out how that tradition disappeared in those intervening years, right? And made me such an alternative, I suppose, to the Irish language in terms of Orangism and Unionism. I do have to say I had a bad experience on Newry Moor District Council where Irish was basically rammed down Unionist throats by particularly Sinn Féin members. And I think it has been politicised. I think that's been to the detriment of it. I respect and know quite a lot of Irish language lovers and people who cherish the language. But I do think that there is, in a very divided society in Northern Ireland, and it's never more divided as it is when people prepare to go to the polls, as we are now. I think I just worry that that Irish continues to be used as a political weapon, and that I think is a great tragedy. That I think is my 3 minutes. So in order to abide with the wishes of the organisers, I'll be quiet now. Thank you.
Gormina Magadani, thank you very much for your contribution and for sticking to the time. And I now call on Ida Milne to make her response.
Thank you very much. I'm very honoured to be asked to talk at this. I've really enjoyed it. I lived in listening to the contributions that have gone before. I lived in Belfast from 2014 until 2018, and at that stage I came across Linda and Terrace, and I was really charmed by the way she was depoliticising the language and, you know, showing this lovely engagement with it. And I'm now also delighted to be virtually introduced to the legend that's Gary Hastings, and I see quite why he is a legend. Anybody who can convey such difficult topics with such good humour is an asset to any society. And likewise, I share with him the experience of often being the only Protestant in the room. I teach in a Catholic third level college where my difference is embraced, and where in fact our Catholic priest president insisted that I should launch Protestant and Irish there, which we did to a room full of different colours of clerics, and Martin Mansell launching it with the background slide of the Derry Girls differences picture, which I forgot to take down before Mansell began to talk, but he held it in very good humour. I grew up in a Protestant family in County Wexford. I was just thinking, I'm actually, when Linda was describing her ethnic heritage, I'm 6/8 Cromwellian, so I probably would be the kind of person who shouldn't really embrace the Irish language. But we were constantly reminded, you know, of this as being part of our cultural heritage, this love of Irish, and the Douglas Hyde in particular was held up to us as a real hero. We spoke bits of Irish in daily life. It was quite common to us. And we'd also used it going abroad as a Chongarunda, which I think many Irish people do. So it was just cultural and not political. And my sister and mother both studied Irish at third level in UCD and TCD. My mother's interest in the language stemmed from her days in the collegiate school in Selbridge, and she often talked reverentially about her Irish teacher, Miss O'Connor. And later, Brendan O'Hare told me that he considered Miss O'Connor was one of the most finest exponents of the Irish language. And in our Church of Ireland National School, St. Edens in Ferns, one of our teachers had come from an Irish-speaking family in West Cork, had fled actually during the revolutionary period, while the others had trained in the Church of Ireland Training College and Coláiste Móví. And one day I remember so distinctly sitting in the first year in the junior classroom and seeing the expression on a Kerry Kigar's face as he heard Mrs. Rothwell, Elizabeth Rothwell, quiz us first and second year's students on our tables, Oscailga. It was just remarkable. And he just burst into laughter at the end of it as we repeated all the rote of the tables, Oscailga. And with hindsight, he'd probably an entirely different expectation. And I think that's the kind of way I like to challenge when we meet kind of myth or supposition about Protestants. It was only when moving outside our Southeast Protestant community they came to understand two other perspectives on Protestant engagement with the language, ones that have been mentioned already. One was that some Protestants felt it an unwelcome imposition on their education and identity. And the other was that non-Protestants often thought we might have objections to the language, or indeed have some kind of innate inability, a genetic disposition not to be able to speak it. So in the historical perspective, to address the first one then, in the 19th century, Protestants were very much part of the initiation of the Gaelic revival. But the rise in nationalist and Republican sentiment at the start of the 20th century and its link with the language revival movement seemed to have a dampening effect on Protestant enthusiasm for the language. Just as a research field of mine, the politicization of the GAA in the same period had a dampening effect on early Protestant enthusiasm for playing Gaelic games. And again, that has been a hidden history too. My late and rather wonderful mother-in-law, Anne Corrie, was from West Clare, and that was a community where she didn't know any Protestants. There were very few families there. And she was very surprised that I had even learned Irish. And I did through those fine national school teachers, and also in Newtown School in Waterford, where Fred Foster Roy's father, a Cavan man, and Joe Falvey both instilled in us a real love of Filiach Tascailga. For example, Antonin Raftery's Inish Choctanari, a poem written about Irish in Irish about the life of a wanderer roaming from town to town, telling stories and meeting new people, is perhaps one of the influences on my own engagement with oral and community history. Later, when I went to college, I studied journalism at first, and there I did encounter difficulty. I did both French and Irish, but I quickly dropped the Irish because I did find the teacher was quite political and really couldn't understand that a Protestant would want to speak Irish. But my difficulty with her was she spoke Connemara Irish, and I could do Munster Irish or Northern Irish, but not Connemara Irish. So for some Protestants, engagements with cultural movements like the Language Gaelic Games, the ICA, and with agricultural movements was a way of engaging with their communities, their local communities in independent Ireland, and of showing that they really wanted to fit in. But it was often done quietly, precisely because they wanted to fit in. So that's my tuppence worth, and thank you very much.
Great, Carmela Magataida. That's another perspective, and it's fantastic that we've got so many insights so far. on people's journey and experiences with the Irish language. And I'd now like to call in Trevor Ringland to share his experiences and to respond to the two speakers.
Can I just thank Anne and the organisers and for pulling this together, and to Linda and Gary for their contribution, and my fellow contributors. If I could just approach it and say that I live in a place in Northern Ireland where 83% of people are shown to be happy enough with the place, and it's actually doing quite well at the minute. And if we got relationships wrong in the last 100 years across this island and in Northern Ireland, then I think the challenge is that we get relationships right in the next 100 years. And part of that is the cultural debate. And I really do welcome this discussion. I think there needs to be much more of this, because somehow we have to take the hatred out of that debate. Irish language, as far as I can see, is thriving in Northern Ireland. For many, there is a warmth to it. For others, there's not, for a variety of reasons, as Gary has mentioned, or as Danny has mentioned to some extent. But really, we should be having a better conversation. And that's why I welcome this. How do we communicate better through our languages and through our culture? How do we take it out of the hands of those who weaponize it? It is a British language. It's part of our diverse cultures of British Irishness that we have in Northern Ireland. And it's also Gaelic quite often as well, which is very much linked to the influence of Scotland, as is other parts of culture in Northern Ireland. But it has a place, and it very much has a place. And what people tend to forget about, certainly those from pro-union background, is that they love this part of Ireland that we share called Northern Ireland. And most of us love the island of Ireland as well. And that's a good place to start in having such a debate. And somehow we have to take it off those who want to use it as a threat or as an exclusive way or to divide people. And the debate is, what is its place? Northern Ireland, unlike the rest of Ireland, did have an influx of people from Scotland and the north of England, and that also has had a cultural impact here. And so it's finding a way to mold those different cultures together in an interdependent society that allows people to have those differences, but also finds ways of working together so that that society as a whole does well. Seamus Heaney, you often use his phrase, 2 buckets are easier carried than one, I stand in between. Or Edna Longley talked of Northern Ireland as being a cultural corridor between Gaelic Irish and that British Irish tradition as well. So we have to find a way of de-weaponizing it. It's an inclusion rather than exclusion. As I said, interdependence. One idea is, let's teach our young people 50 words and expressions of Irish. Linda knows that I took part in classes down in her centre, and as I say, I had the best teacher in the world and she had the worst pupil. So let's start saying, recognizing it's part of who we are as a people. It's important to our friends and to our neighbours, and if it's important to our friends and neighbours, then it should also be important to us. Also, let's look at education. If we're going to have cultural segregation, which I am not in favour of segregating our kids in any way in education, then let's see how, if kids do choose to go to Irish language schools, how do they maintain friendships with other 4-year-olds and stay friends throughout their lives? That can be accommodated through sport, through cultural engagement and other ways. But it is very much, let's change the nature of the debate between friends as to how we enjoy all the diverse cultures that we have in our society in a non-threatening way and in a non-attempt to dominate, which too many use it for. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Trevor, and I think we'll all agree with not wanting to weaponize the Irish language, because it can only lead to, I think, the detriment and turn people off. But I think it's important that we hear those experiences at the same time. So our final respondent is Deirdre Nuttall, and now calling on Deirdre to give her response.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I'd like to congratulate Linda on her excellent initiative in Belfast, and then also Anne Lodge and everyone else who organised this webinar this evening. My own experience isn't really of much interest. I went through the Catholic education system and I don't consider myself part of the Protestant community. But in researching my book, which was published last year, the Irish came up quite a lot. I think in independent Ireland, there were 2 initial ways of responding. Some people responded and some educational institutions responded with a degree of hostility, feeling that Irish wasn't for them, it wasn't part of their culture. And you'd come across stories of people hiding their French book in their Irish book so they could whip out the Irish book if the school inspector turned up, but people not really engaging with Irish very much at all. Conversely, some other people responded to Irish as a way of expressing Irishness without becoming too political. So for some people, perhaps especially the generation that came of age after independence, they would have seen Irish in some cases as a way to feel Irish without going into their parents' political views or the more negative attitudes towards Irish. But most importantly, in a way, and something that hasn't been mentioned by anyone else, is the way in which knowing Irish was a mode of becoming socially upwardly mobile for a lot of young kids from lower income Protestant families. So quite a lot of young people in the 30s, 40s, 50s who would have otherwise left school at 14 and gone to work on the farm or gone into an apprenticeship or gone into domestic service. If they were academically gifted, they could get scholarships to institutions like Coláiste Móví, where they would learn to become teachers. And in this way, they would become socially upwardly mobile themselves, but they were also able to encourage greater mobility, social mobility in general among the Protestant communities by providing a good standard of Irish education in Church of Ireland national schools. So that's, I think, a very interesting thread. That's almost all I have to say, but I just wanted to finish with a story about a Nigerian gentleman I met here in Dublin some years ago. He and his wife moved into a roughish part of the North Inner City. And when they were deciding where to send their kids to school, they decided that they would send them to the local Gael school. And this was considered a really baffling decision by a lot of people. But he felt that the Irish language belonged to his kids as much as anyone else, given that his kids were growing up in Ireland. And for him, it was an easy decision to make. He felt it was the best school in the area, and that knowing Irish would be good for his children and that it would help them to feel more Irish. So, if that decision can be taken, I think, by recent arrivals in Ireland from Nigeria, I think that is a useful lesson that we might all look at when we consider our own relationship with Irish.
Okay, Gurmila Margaret, Deirdre, so that concludes our speakers, our two keynotes, Linda and Gary, and the respondents, Danny, Ida, Trevor, and Deirdre. So now it's open to the floor, and it's open to you on Zoom at home to send in questions for the keynote speakers and respondents. So I'd like to invite questions at this point. Anyone like to start? So if you'd like to come up and to the microphone and to ask the question.
This is kind of really more of a comment than a question, but as I said to someone before this started, when we were drinking tea and eating biscuits, I'm very interested in history, and especially in the history of language itself, how it's molded our country. And my understanding is that there's never really been a time in history when Protestants, as they're sometimes are called, or Unionists, or as they're sometimes called, were not interested in Irish. So I think this may sound like kind of I suppose like a contrarian position, but I don't think efforts to politicize it were ever really successful. Maybe they were even somewhat half-hearted.
Gurmila Margaret, I don't know if Linda or Gary would like to respond in any way to that question, comment.
I'd be keen to respond to that, and maybe some of the other things that were said. And I have the greatest respect for Trevor, but I disagree on some things. People talk a lot about the politicization of the language. They talk a lot about the weaponization of the language. And to be honest, I mean, as somebody who's involved within the Irish language sector in Belfast, who started to learn it 11 years ago, that's not what I see. I see people who are interested in the language, who love the language, who struggle with the language. I don't see this weaponization. You know, yes, I see Sinn Féin, you know, fighting for language rights, Conradh na Gaeilge fighting for language rights. I don't call that weaponization. I call that language rights. You know, it's the same thing that happened in Wales. It's the same thing that happens in other parts of the world. It's the same thing that happened in Scotland, where people said, you know, we want legislation to protect our language. And, you know, if you call that politicization and you call that weaponization, I'm not sure if you've got that right. Now, I know in our troubles in Northern Ireland, and, you know, people, we get the, you know, every word spoken in Irish and all the rest of it. That was, what, over 40 years ago. You know, even people within the Republican movement, you know, where they seen the language as a sort of a symbol. Even a lot, you know, they have moved on. You know, Chucky Arla is of yesterday. And I genuinely believe too that, you know, for anybody who does feel that the language is very political or weaponized or whatever, then to me the solution, the best solution to that is to have more diversity within the Irish language sector. And that means Protestants learning it, Protestants embracing it, Protestants taking ownership of it, becoming qualified in it and taking jobs in it. That's how you change things. Not by standing outside, pointing a finger and saying, oh, you know, it's political, it's weaponized, don't want anything to do with it. You know, that's how you weaponize it, in my opinion.
Linda, if I could come back to you on that, I certainly wasn't suggesting.
No, Trevor, and I know you weren't, and I'm not attacking you. Because
I think with some though, I think with some they have used it and weaponized it. And I think if you go down around the country, it is seen as a chilling factor in some of those areas. And I think those of us who want to create a genuinely shared Northern Ireland have to recognise that concern and take that concern on board. When I played rugby for Ireland, I first of all, Ginger McLaughlin taught me how to sing the soldier song in Irish, to the extent that I knew the words of the soldier song in Irish and not in English. But I always say that the symbols that we played in Dublin under, where the tricolour and the soldier song was sung, but it was a very different soldier song and a very different tricolour than that was being played in Lansdowne Road in those days, in a spirit of friendship, than the one wrapped around the IRA that were trying to kill members of my family and other people in our society, and driving the hatreds and driving the divisions, as were others who also tend to weaponize it by making more of it, which I think is your point, than they otherwise should, because some people get offended by something no matter what you do.
Yeah.
One of the points I left out of my discussion was that having taken part in the education of Irish language and enjoying that 6 weeks, which I really did, I also got a better understanding of it, of being all around us. And as I point out to my friends, that road sign is Irish. And if you all would be interested to know what that road sign means. And so there's a real opportunity for those of us who want it to be part of our society and be fully embraced by all of us who live in Northern Ireland, to take it on board and really drive the constructive debate around it, and not let it be used in any way that maintains or deepens divisions. That's really the point I'm making. But we should be, you know, realistic about some do use it in that way, and some are too easy to be offended as well. And that applies to other cultures as well, that some use culture in you know, some in our society use culture as a weapon, and that's right across our sectors and right across our cultures. So that's the point I'm trying to make.
I think one of the points you make is very good, Trevor, and I think we very much agree on that. It's lack of education, lack of knowledge, and you know, this is one of the things that has really I feel strongly about. The people within the Protestant community, they react to something, they react to what they've been told, and they react because they don't have the full knowledge. And I question why that is. I question why I was never allowed to know it's in our place names. And I've found over the last 10 years that when you talk to people from the Protestant community, I mean, the majority of people are rational, reasonable people, as you know, Trevor. And one of the things they say is, why was I never told that? If I had have understood that, because all they do know is Chucky Arla. And, you know, Tilly Arla isn't going to draw anybody from the Protestant community towards Irish, as we know. So education, yeah.
And as you know, when Brian O'Driscoll went to make a, sorry, I won't hog this conversation, when Brian O'Driscoll went to make a programme on Ireland's call, the anthem that used at Irish rugby matches, and he wanted to meet Orangemen and women. And so I got a friend of mine to look after him, and he asked the question, you know, who do you support when Ireland are playing England? And all the young Orangemen looked at him and said, why, Ireland, of course. And it's again that lack of knowledge of people, that lack of engagement, that we don't know each other. And that's right across the board. And that's the challenge to those who use hatred as their weapon. And sorry, I won't talk anymore.
If I could maybe broaden this, I did a lot of research into Orange music and lambegs and stuff. And what I found was that the boys who played the music and played the lambegs and the fifes loved it and were down about it. There was a bunch of idiots who were extremely political, but they were usually crap musicians. And some of the most political Irish speakers I know are amongst the worst Irish speakers as well. So the ones who are interested, doing it and involved in it on both sides of the house, I'm saying with the language and the Orange music, they love it and they're down about it. And that's as far as it goes. The political stuff is perceived as, the political perception is placed on it. So most people doing Irish, from the Orange side of things, it's perceived as being this, that, and the other thing. And to be honest, sometimes it has been used that way, but a minority of people have done that. Most people involved in Irish are not actually, aren't interested in that end of things. The same as the true of the boys in the bands and with drums as well. Most of them are just cracked about the music, and it happens to be Orange, except for some boys.
Yeah. I say that I because I think I was the one in my contribution who warned against the politicalization of the language, and I talked a little about my experience as a member of Newry and Moore District Council in a unionist minority, substantial nationalist Republican majority, and there was an element. I'm sorry to say this, but I mean I have to be honest and reflect my experience in that, because what invariably happened when it came to the naming of streets and roads, which was and remains a council responsibility, a survey letter would be sent out from the Irish language unit at Newry and Moore District Council, as it was then, right? And to be fair, they sent a survey out to every household on the road or street or housing development. When the responses came back, in a street of 100 houses, 10 people responded. That wasn't counted as 10% responding. In fact, if 10 people responded in favour of wanting an Irish nameplate, it was counted as 100%. So there was, I mean, it wasn't quite interfering with democracy, but it wasn't far off it. I mean, and the other thing that rankled slightly, that was the insistence that the Irish inscription would have predominance on the roadside over the English. Now, whether we like it or not, whether anybody likes it or not, English is the most spoken language, certainly in Europe, if not the world, or it may be second to Portuguese or something like that because of South America. But in large part, in the more modern era, English has been a dominant language in terms of that. Now, there is, of course, a place for minority languages and for those who choose to want to learn them. I have no interest in that, and I say that respectfully. I don't say it aggressively. I don't object to it in terms of having a place and to be cherished by those who love and acknowledge it. But I think to try and completely deny that there hasn't been a politicisation of it, and that it hasn't been used as a political weapon, particularly in Northern Ireland, I think is a bit of a gloss on things.
I don't think I'm trying to say there hasn't been a politicisation of it, Danny. What I'm trying to say is that as we sit today, the people that I see politicising it, unfortunately, are in my own side of the house. And that's what I very much see. I see people standing up for language rights, and I think they're entitled to. And, you know, some of the things that I have seen, I mean, you've mentioned that in the council. I don't deny that, and I'm sure that did happen. But, you know, I'm also aware in Belfast City Council that it was geared up against the Irish language. So what happened in Belfast City Council was that the notifications went out and there had to be a majority. Now, I think that's fair that there should be a majority in the street. The problem was that if people didn't respond, they weren't counted as a maybe or a no response. They were counted as a no. So if there were empty houses in the street, or somebody was just, you know, didn't want to know, that wasn't seen as don't care. It was seen as negative. Now, that is in the process of changing. So unfortunately, and we know this, and this has nothing to do with the language. This is Northern Ireland. This is parties. This is the bickering and the pettiness. And I hate the fact that the language gets caught up in that. I don't want to defend any of that. I acknowledge that that happens. And I think Gary made a good point, and I've seen that as well. You know, I'm involved in the Irish language sector. I am friendly with lots of Irish language people. I don't see politicisation within them. I see it outside. And that's the problem that we need to address here. Not the people who have a genuine love for the language, who want to promote the language and who want to have language rights, and they're entitled to do that. And because some councils behave badly or some people behave badly, is that, you know, justification that Irish speakers who are asking for genuine rights that are available in other parts of the UK, that they should suffer? No, I think that's wrong. And I have seen the degrading way that the Irish language is treated, the disrespect. And, you know, I'm not talking about your party, though. There's been times that, you know, there's been things within your own party, Danny, but definitely another unionist party. And, you know, people have clapped and cheered that. And that is just wrong. And we would not permit that if it was Chinese or, you know, Polish. And why would we? You know, we would have more respect. So we should have the same respect for the Irish language. And to sit here and say, well, it's okay to deny people their rights. It's okay to treat Irish speakers badly. It's okay to denigrate the Irish language because, you know, we had these people 50 years ago who did this, or we have this, you know, who does that. They are in the wrong, and we can acknowledge that, but we shouldn't have to suffer because of that. And I'm on the receiving point of that I'm supposed to suffer because I'm a Protestant and I want to speak Irish and I want to learn Irish and I want to encourage other people. I'm supposed to suffer because somebody 50 years ago said every word in Irish is a bullet in the gun or whatever. No, I'm not accepting that because that's just wrong and it's unjust.
Linda, Tommy, can Gary Shackington, I just cut in there if I may. So I think we've had a good over and back on that particular issue and got some interesting viewpoints on it. Unfortunately, we've run slightly over time, so I'm going to call a halt to proceedings. I think the seminar tonight has been really interesting, and I think the range of perspectives we've received, and I think the insights, there's certainly material there, I think, for Gary in a stand-up routine. So perhaps that could be the subject of the next webinar that we have. And the Church of Ireland Centre might be onto something there. Once we get past COVID, you could have a sellout crowd, I think, for the next one. But not to trivialize the nature of the discussion. I think that it has been really interesting, and I think, as a number of speakers said, it's by hearing the different perspectives that we learn. And certainly for me tonight, I've learned a lot about, I suppose, the different experience that people have had in relation to Irish and what has molded those attitudes and so on. And I suppose those of us who are interested in promoting the Irish language, then we need to understand that background and that life history and the thoroughness that Linda has referred to in her journey with the Irish language. And the better we understand that, then the better we can help to promote Irish in a sensitive way, taking on board perhaps the negative experiences that people have had, but also the fantastic positive experience that have been shared with us as well tonight. So Guramila Magav as Nadine Ta, Os Makor, Nadine Ta, Erlina, Agus Akahara Lishna Kaintori, Linda, Gary, Danny, Ida, Trevor, Deirdre, Agus Lishan Olive, Anne Lodge. Special thanks to Anne Lodge, the director of the Church of Ireland Centre at TCU, for organising tonight's webinar. All of you in the audience for coming out to attend, and those of you at home, I hope that you found food for thought and that we'll meet again to discuss these issues further. So, Guramila Magav.